The 10th Pan Book of Horror Stories. Audiobooks. The pain was almost unbearable. He could feel the hair and the flesh being ripped and stripped away from his skull, and he could feel the warm, sticky blood seeping down his neck and running down his face, blurring his vision so that he saw everything through a red mist. His screams increased in both volume and intensity, and his heart pounded in his chest like a sledgehammer. His fear became so total that it began to paralyze him. He could find no strength to continue his useless struggle, and he was finding it hard to breathe. His screams were reduced to babbling pleas for mercy, and finally broke off into hoarse, choking sobs. He began to cry like a child, the salt tears mingling with the blood in his mouth. Something, some fat thing, minced her and munched her, chewed her and champed her. It made ever such a nasty mess in the kitchen. It ran down the street outside for a few yards and then disappeared abruptly at the edge of a manhole cover. Obviously some fat thing had gone underground. When would the fat thing strike again? Only the fat thing knew. He passed the statues without returning their blank stares, and was lost in the crowd buying tickets at the various windows. There was comfort in crowds, an anonymity that came as a relief, like a cigarette. As he lit up, he was aware, it was the last thing he was aware of, that the cigarette had fallen to the ground. Then darkness, without pain. He awoke under the sun, his eyes staring at a sky innocently blue. No smell of industry trailed the cloud that moved from right to left. His body was agreeably warm, but he could not move. His naked legs and arms were clamped in iron grips. The grips were not painful. They simply kept him where he was, spread-eagled on his back. The drug they had given him perhaps made him languid, and as he gazed at the sky, he remembered days from his childhood, long ago, and fishing in small ponds. The clouds had been diaphanous even then, sailing through noons that lasted, it seemed, forever. You are the subject of an experiment. You have had 147 predecessors. You are situated on the summit of a steel-topped chimney. You can leave by jumping outwards or inwards, but you will decide before noon. At this moment, careless whether the sky heard or not, he began to scream. She appeared to have been heavily sedated, and her eyes kept flickering, as if the lids were too heavy for her to keep open. "I had to see you again," he repeated. "But what's the matter? Are you in pain?" He sank to his knees beside the couch, and held one of her small hot hands in his. As his other hand rested lightly on the blanket over her thigh, however, an icy finger of horror ruffled the nerves at the nape of his neck. Then it sped down his spine, when he drew back and looked down at the length of her. The bulge made by her body under the blanket ended halfway down the couch. He flicked back the bedclothes so that his eyes could confirm the ghastly evidence of his hand. The girl was still naked, but it was not her sun-kissed shoulders or golden breasts that held his gaze. Instead, he stared unbelievingly at the white bandages which swathed her hips. Below these there was nothing. Halfway down the passage a door stood ajar, and the girl looked in. This room was at the back of the house. The roof had fallen in, and one wall crumbled to dust. Sand had swept in and covered the floor. Alone, abandoned in the room, beneath the stark, broken beams, was a rocking horse. The girl went forward with her lantern and turned the yellow light over the toy. Its colours had been burnt out by the sun, but here and there in the carved, curled mane, and in each staring, detailed eyeball, a scrap of paint remained. She pushed the horse, and it rocked slowly with clouds of dust pouring from its flanks. "It is so big," the girl said in wonder. "My mother brought it with her from the city. It had been hers since she was a child." She stooped, suddenly seeing the strange bonds which circled each of the horse's legs. "Why ropes here?" she asked. "Who would tie up a rocking horse?" The fat thing had oozed again. All of London rose in horror. Terror stalked the night-long streets. Through the darkness of the sewers, the fat thing oozed on with a contented belly, if you can call it a belly. It may have been Coronation Week, but 16 guineas was still overcharging. "Done," said the rubber-faced man, feeling Jack's flabby forearm with his fingers. "Come upstairs," said Jack, his chubby face beaming. "I'll show you to your room." The rubber-faced man followed him upstairs, carrying only a large suitcase which contained flour, vanilla flavouring, sausage meat, and raspberries, mingled with some dodgy things from the sewer. He could feel the knot beginning to give way. He would have to jump now, to let go as he reached the end of his rope before it broke. The ground couldn't be all that far. He let go, falling, falling, far farther than he had expected. The rocks hit him in a blinding, smashing, flaming sheet of pain which engulfed him and tore away his senses. There was no sound for 5 minutes, nothing. Then the moaning began, high and thin, inhuman in the still air. The cold was driving into him through the thinness of his shirt, up the shattered bones of his legs. Already the blood that ran down them had clotted and frozen, no longer running away. Already the pain that engulfed him was changing, eating into his spine, and through his entrails, up into his chest. He could hear the wailing still, but thinner, fainter. Whoever was crying was moving farther away, farther and farther. He stared at her, frowning. As he did so, her face and body crumbled, the flesh falling away till the bones showed, and it was a skeleton in a blue dressing gown that stood and grumbled at him, and then turned and walked out of the door through the sea of blood. His mind collapsed, but when he came to himself he was sitting on the edge of his bed, half dressed. The blood was gone, and now a beautiful dark-haired young girl stood near him, smiling on him softly. At mealtimes he was haunted by the large black spider which had first appeared dead in his morning cup of tea. But sometimes it was not dead, and once it opened tiny red eyes and watched him as he ate. John's head detached itself from his shoulders and went floating round the room like a balloon. It spoke to him for some time from a corner of the ceiling. Then at last it floated back down and resettled itself on John's shoulders, but upside down, and a fountain of sparkling green water began issuing from the severed vertebrae. He was screaming, and it seemed to him that he screamed for days, for months, for years, forever.